This is the video testimony of Elden Vestal in the matter of City of Los Angeles water right license 10191 and 10192 for diversion of water from streams tributary to Mono Lake. My name is Don Anglin. I'm a notary public and certified legal video specialist employed by Capitol Reporters, 2340 Harvard Street, Sacramento, California. This deposition is being held at 7329 Silverado Trail, Yountville, California. The date, November 3, 1993. The time is approximately 2:51. Will counsel please identify themselves and indicate the parties they represent, and then will the court reporter swear the witness, and we can begin. Please.
Michael Valentine, Staff Counsel, State Lands Commission.
Bruce Dodge, National Audubon Society and the Mono Lake Committee.
Richard Roos-Collins, representing California Trout.
Elden Vestal, witness.
Harold Thomas, Department of Fish and Game, Staff Counsel.
Virginia Cahill, McDonough, Holland, and Allen, representing the California Department of Fish and Game.
Diane Lockreff, representing LADWP.
Thomas Birmingham, Chronic Moskowitz, Tiedemann and Gerard on behalf of the Department of Water and Power of the City of Los Angeles and the City of Los Angeles.
Swear the witness, please.
Just a minute. I'd like to go there as well.
Sorry.
Thanks, I didn't see it.
I'm Dan Frank, staff attorney with the State Water Resources Control Board.
Would you raise your right hand, please, Mr. Vestal? Do you swear that the testimony you will give in this proceeding will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Vestal, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
We are here to take your deposition. You understand that we will conduct this deposition as though you were before the board in this proceeding.
Yes.
Who called you as a witness in this proceeding?
You did, representing Cal Trout.
And you also were called as a witness by the Department of Fish and Game and the Mono Lake Committee?
Yes, this is my understanding.
Your written testimony is Cal Trout Exhibit 5 in this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
Is that testimony true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
There are a few corrections that should be made. Some collation as far as pinpointing the numbers of the exhibits and so on, but otherwise it's true and correct.
Mr. Vestal, you are referring to the references to the exhibits as set forth in your written testimony? There are some typographic errors in those references?
That is correct.
And that is the responsibility of my firm. We will submit a corrected declaration with the correct references to exhibits in connection with the videotape and the transcript of this deposition.
This is my understanding, yes, sir.
But other than those typographic errors, is your written testimony true and correct?
Yes, it is.
Are your qualifications set forth in Cal Trout Exhibit 5A?
Yes, they are.
Please summarize your qualifications as they relate to Rush and Levining Creeks.
Well, I was employed by the Department of Fish and Game and entered the as a junior fisheries researcher and entered the Eastern California area in Mono County in 1938 and served in several capacities in the period from 1938, principally 1939 through 1950, at which time I left that area and transferred to another region in Fresno.
And you continued with the Department of Fish and Game until your retirement?
Yes, I did. I was transferred on a promotion to the coastal region, to San Francisco, and served there for 12 years with headquarters here at Yountville until my retirement at the end of December 1978.
What is your professional degree in?
In zoology.
You first visited the Mono Basin as an employee of the Department of Fish and Game on April 30th, 1938. Is
Yes,
that correct?
I did.
And you were employed as a fishery researcher on behalf of the Department of Fish and Game from that time until 1940?
That's right.
And in 1940 you became the district biologist?
That's right. Actually, I became a district biologist about March of 1939 when I returned from the survey work on the north coast in anadromous fisheries, salmon and steelhead, and survey of the Eel River Basin in that time. And from that time on, it was my understanding I would be the district fisheries biologist for this area.
What were your responsibilities with respect to Rush and Levining creeks?
Well, they were part of a initially they were part of a region-wide inventory of lakes and streams in the Inyo-Mona area, by which we would develop a base for fisheries management activities in subsequent years.
While you were employed as a fisheries researcher and subsequently as the district biologist, did you live in the vicinity of Rush and Levining creeks?
Yes, after initial, you might say, residence at Mount Whitney Hatchery during that first winter, and then I took residence in the spring at on one end of Fern Creek Hatchery. I then very shortly, it wasn't long before I married my wife, and we settled down at Gull Lake, a few miles away, and made that my headquarters for activities in the district.
You mentioned Fern Creek Hatchery. That's on Upper Rush Creek?
On Fern Creek, which is a tributary to Upper Rush Creek, above Grant Lake.
Could you describe more specifically the activities you undertook as a Department of Fish and Game employee to manage or to study the fisheries of Rush and Levining creeks?
Well, it was a matter of making observations. My initial assignment in 1939 and beginning in 1939 was a creel census project at June Lake, testing the hatchery product, the catchable trout, in the planning program there at June Lake. And so, as time permitted, I would make lake and stream observations out in the Mono Basin and tributaries to Mono Lake within that area, and with particular interest to the development of the City of Los Angeles and its diversions from Levining Creek on around the basin to Grant Lake, and via the Mona Tunnel to as part of the Owens Valley Aqueduct project. And as time permitted, then I would gather information and add to the survey files, the inventory files, so to speak, and then as the season progressed, aside from the June Lake project, devote some time, especially summer and early fall, to High Lake inventory work, surveys of lakes and streams in the higher lakes. But it was my responsibility to check on various activities, results of to fishing, the catch in the tributaries, the lakes and the streams, and to look in on any pollution or any changes in the streams or lakes, their tributaries, to conduct a liaison with the Forest Service and people that with whom we were working in these various activities, to contact the wardens with whom it was my responsible to conduct a continuing liaison for information. Also, the same with the hatchery people. Mr. George McLeod, the superintendent of hatcheries for the area, and the various hatchery people within the area, including, of course, I lived with Mr. Hussey. The Ivo Hussey was the state hatchman there at Fern Creek, and quite a bit of work was done through Ivo because of his intimate contacts within and without the basin before my time.
You kept records of your activities as a fishery researcher and later district biologist, didn't you?
Yes, it was part of our regular regular program responsibility to keep daily logs and summarize these in terms of weekly reports, and then at the end of each month to bring it all together in a monthly report. And this information was submitted to the chief of the Bureau of Fish Conservation in San Francisco, keeping a copy for myself and retaining a copy for the district file.
Some of the daily, weekly, and monthly reports which you prepared at that time are set forth as Caltrout Exhibit 5B. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, you served in the military during World War II.
Yes.
So you left the Mono Basin in 1941?
I left the Mono Basin at the 2nd of December 1942.
1942. And you returned when?
In March of 1946.
And you had what responsibilities in 1946 as a Department of Fish and Game employee?
Well, having completed at the end of that first period, pre-war period, that is, we're talking about World War II now, we had laid some foundation for test stream studies in Lower Rush Creek. And it was initially my responsibility to reconnoiter again Lower Rush Creek with that program in mind. And it was again visited with the supervising fisheries biologist and the chief of the Bureau, and the decision was made to forthwith, starting in 1947, to initiate that program on stream tests to evaluate the stocking of catchable trout product from Hot Creek Hatchery.
Mr. Vestal, the board is very familiar with that 1954 article. It was addressed at length last week by Dr. Chapman and Dr. Platts. In the interest of time, why don't we move on now to the substance of your written testimony. You describe Rush Creek before 1941 as a fisherman's paradise. Is that your opinion?
Well, it actually, this was touted as a fisherman's paradise as a result of information from the Rush Creek Ranch, which was located at the lower Rush Creek, through various resorts and businesses in the area. The Rainbow Angling Club. There was an outdoor writer from the Pasadena Star-News named Joe Mears, whom I knew rather well, member of the Western Western Outdoor Writers of America. And all this came together in the phrase of paradise, and Mr. Mears said that he rated told me that he rated among Eastern California waters, Mono County waters in particular, Rush Creek number 4 in the list, Hot Creek being number 1, fourth in the popularity and the quality of fishing in Lower Rush Creek. So that dates back some years.
Let's focus on the fishery itself. The biological quality of the fishery as it existed in Rush Creek before 1941. How would you characterize that fishery?
Well, actually, it was basically a good fishery. There was it had been stocked some, but it was based below. In addition to the stocking that took place during the war, it was based on natural propagation of brown trout. Where I'm referring now specifically to Lower Rush Creek, from the Narrows to Grant Lake, and
that's below Highway 395.
That's below Highway 395 and below what has been called this geologic feature, the Gorge or the Narrows. And it certainly could be classified as a good fishery. The reach from the Narrows to Grant Lake was in part especially above the lowest point of diversion. From there up to what we call the Bend was also, according to I was of this opinion, but also opinion of the wardens and anglers, local anglers who worked it and fished it. They thought that they felt that it was had good qualities also, and certainly for them produced some good trout.
Did the Department of Fish and Game or any other entity take a fish census before 1941, to your knowledge, in Rush Creek?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Now, your written testimony says that the Rush Creek system had a highly productive fishery.
Excuse me, Richard, are you going to conduct this examination as an examination, or are you going to ask Mr. Vestal to summarize his written testimony as we would do in the normal course of the proceedings?
The former.
Can we go off the record, please?
This is the video camera operator. We're now going off the record. This is the video camera operator. We're now back on the record. Please continue.
Mr. Vestal, I have been reminded that time is flying. Unfortunately, fish stories take some time to tell. So let's proceed with this deposition in a different format. Let me ask you to summarize your written testimony with respect to the fish habitat that existed in Rush Creek before 1941.
I believe in order to do that, it would take us back, well back into the historical period. And by that I mean that even in recent weeks, I have conducted a particular study, starting with the USGS Quad Mount Lyell 1901, and such records as we have to indicate that this was the Rush Creek system was a barren, pristine system consisting of 4 lakes and a total, including the lakes, of 20 miles of stream, rich in food, with excellent spawning areas, and judging from the rapid development of the fishery after the introduction of cutthroat about 1880, the population, the fish population, seized upon this habitat all the way from, since there were no barriers, from Mono Lake clear to June Lake, and filled out the habitat rapidly. The native population of each of the lakes, Grant Lake at that time, which was only about 152 acres and about 30 feet deep, up through Silver Lake and Gull Lake and June Lake, were all cutthroat. The result of this was an enormous initial fishery. And this led to such reports as in 1890, when there was documented a catch by two men from Bridgeport taking of some 700 pounds in one day, in November of 1890, of cutthroat from Grant Lake. And from that, the records gradually accumulated after 1900. There were more results of that kind to indicate that this was a great fishery, a very productive fishery. Brown trout were introduced into the system in 1919, about July of 1919, and but the cutthroat continued to dominate the fishery. They were predominant in the fishery for some years, and starting in 1923, the then Division of Fish and Game ran some egg-taking tests after when they had began to develop a egg-taking station on Rush Creek above Grant Lake. Tests in 1923 and 1924, and began large-scale egg-taking with the development of the Fern Creek hatchery in 1925. This situation, for the next about 12 years, there was an average of about 2 million eggs taken a year from that station. And in summation, in their reports to the Fish and Game Commission, biennial reports to the Fish and Game Commission, it showed that even at that time, after many years and some developments had begun in the system, it was a very large fishery and a very large egg take. Beginning early in 1930s, starting around 1932, at that time the brown trout had begun to make themselves make a showing in the Rush Creek system, and gradually dominated the fishery. They tended to gravitate their center of the population to Grant Lake and lower Rush Creek, and so it was initially a very large fishery, and led to within the habitat. The habitat had to be very favorable from the start, and then changes began to occur as a result of developments in the system, and some changes occurred as far as the habitat itself, as pertained to the habitat.
Please summarize your written testimony regarding the impact of grazing and also irrigation diversion on the fishery of Rush Creek before 1941.
Grazing, as far as certainly grazing ranged, sheep were ranged, cattle and sheep were ranged in the basin. I don't believe, it's my opinion that grazing did not make serious inroads in in the habitat and in turn in the fish population, because the herders would water their stock and move them out into the range for forage. They'd water their stock at intervals and not linger for any great length of time around the waterways, the waters. So I don't think the impact was all that great as far as grazing goes. But as far as irrigation goes, there was an increasing impact from large diversions, sections of the stream, particularly below, immediately above Old Highway 395 down to the gorge, were dried up at times. Even though for most years there was inflow, there was return flow and inflow from springs in both Lower Parker and Walker Creeks. As far as the reach below the gorge, otherwise called the Narrows, this was sustained as time went on more and more by the springs. Starting in 1947, this was after the major diversions by the city of Los Angeles out of the basin via the Divining Aqueduct and Mono Tunnel. No water was put down Rush Creek, and so the springs below the gorge, which is below Highway 395, sustained the stream, with the principal inflow for the next several years during our chest stream project there.
Again, summarizing your written testimony, how would you compare the impact of LA's diversions after 1941 to the impact of irrigation diversions and grazing before 1941 on the fishery?
I think after 1941, the impact was increasingly severe. It was my impression, and also the impression in consultation with more others of our other department, the fisheries people and the wardens, that there was an increasing impact. Some years were better water years than others, and the stream benefited from those good water years, better water years. But it amounted to a gradual deterioration of the habitat between especially between the Grant Lake and the Narrows, and certainly below the lowermost diversion point, just above Old Highway 395. As time went on, and with that, with the diminution of outflow from the releases, I should say, for irrigation, the springs gradually dried up, and releases, the springs in the aggregate fell from 24 second feet in 1947 to only an average of about 2 second feet in 1951. As a matter of fact, Mr. Beck, in his report in 1951, said that reported that at one point that in that year the flow may have gotten as low as 1 second foot. So it was a gradual constriction with diminution of flow, and the habitat was drying up.
Let's turn now to Lee Vining Creek. Please summarize your testimony as to the fishery that existed in Lee Vining Creek before 1941.
The Vining Creek, excuse me. The Vining Creek, prior to 1941, it was a good stream. It was while it was short and comparatively steep and rapid below, rapid and somewhat turbulent at some flows below Highway 395, it was a good stream, and it was considered by local people to be about the best fishing section in the canyon. And this was repeated by several people on several occasions, that opinion. I felt pretty much the same because, partly because of the sustained flow. While the flow got down comparatively low, there was a sustained low. There was good habitat there for good shade and shelter, and comparatively good spawning areas. Some eastern brook, as far as variety goes, eastern brook in the upper section, some rainbow, but still predominantly brown trout. And this was the general, this opinion and response was generally the same, coming from the wardens and fishermen who fished the area, and some of the older townspeople who actually fished the area themselves.
Before 1941, how did irrigation diversions and grazing affect the fishery in Lee Vining Creek?
As I recall, while there were irrigation diversions, the stream never dried up. It was never reported as such, and if it had dried up as a result of irrigation diversions, either above Highway 395 or the diversions for irrigation down in the dairy section, what I call the lower section, I'm sure it would have been reported right away through either the district ranger or through the townspeople, or Mrs. McPherson, who was supervisor at that time, or through Walter Dombrowski, who was also been a supervisor. So it sustained itself fairly well. It was not a good a fishery as, in my opinion, as Rush Creek. The use was not as great, but it was not. But still, it was basically certainly a good fishery.
After 1941, how did LADWP diversions affect the fishery in Lee Vining Creek?
I think actually there were fewer probably a reduction in the population, although we did not make any census. I had to judge this from the reports of anglers and the wardens of fishing on the stream, but my impression was that there was constriction there. There was a downtrend in the fishery in the Vining Creek. We continued to stock. We stocked fingerlings, particularly below the highway, and catchables above, and to some extent this helped sustain the fishery. But there was a gradual downtrend.
Thank you. No further questions. Mr. Dodge?
Let's take a break, can we?
This is the video camera operator. We're now going off the record. This is the video video camera operator. We're now back on the record. Please continue.
Elden, hi, I'm Bruce Dodge, as you know, and I'm going to switch gears with you and not ask you anything about fish, but rather ask you about ducks and other waterfowl at Mono Lake. Well, let me ask you first to affirm that the document I have here in my hand, which is labeled NAS and MLC-1AB, testimony of Elden H. Vestal, and it's 9 numbered paragraphs with your signature at the end, dated September 17, 1993. Let me just ask you to affirm that that is your testimony on ducks and other waterfowl in the Mono Basin.
Yes, it is.
Have you any corrections you wish to make to it today?
Let's see. There are none.
Okay. Now, I'm going to just ask you to summarize your testimony in 2 areas. And one is basically what's covered by paragraph 3. I'd like you to focus in on the time frame that you've already told us about, 1938 to 1950. And focus in on your observations in the fall and the winter of the year, and just ask you to summarize what you observed in terms of ducks and other waterfowl at Mono Lake.
Yes. Well, I had rather frequent opportunities in that time frame to in traveling to and from Bridgeport and other areas within the basin, and also in trips to Rush Creek, and I made 2 circuit trips around Mono Lake, with one in the spring in 1947 and one in the fall with Claude James, the City of Los Angeles hydrographer, in his circuit to measure the level of wells in the city property around Mono Lake. And I, in the later years, especially after when Rush Creek Test Stream was underway, and we had established a weir and trap in Lower Rush Creek. I had a number of occasions to hear and see waterfowl there in the delta region of Rush Creek. In the circuit trips with Mr. James, we saw waterfowl at what they call the Navy Beach, well, in addition to the Delta, the Rush Creek Delta, Navy Beach, Simon Springs, Warm Springs, the DeChambeau Ranch, the Monte Vista Springs, or Fisher Springs, which later became the location of the Danberg Ranch, and then on around to the mouth of or near the mouth of Levining Creek. We, on one occasion, I was invited by Walt Dombrowski to hunt with him, and this was in October of 1940, and we saw, at that time, we saw, and on these other occasions, which were fairly late in the season, numbers of waterfowl that were almost unbelievable. When the ducks were, especially around the ponds there at the Delta, when the ducks would fly up from the ponds, there would still be just thousands of ducks waterfowl, still principally ducks, left on and about the ponds. It was my recollection that at times, as far out across the lake as the eyes could see, there were waterfowl rafted out, and they were scared closer in to the shores. They were rafted out on the lake, and there was just a dark mass of waterfowl on the lake. The principal species, the common species observed were mainly shovers or spoonies, the little ruddies. There were mallards, of course. Mallards were very common, pintails. And then there were other species. There were gadwall and widgeon. And it seemed to me that as the winter season came on, there were more and more and more waterfowl into November and December. I had taken part in earlier years traveling up and down California in coastal areas and around the bay. I had taken part as a member of the staff here within this region, in Region 3 out of Yountville. I took part in aerial census flights with the waterfowl biologists on a couple of occasions, and we toured centers and their technique as Walt did in making his counts over at the Rush Creek ponds and about Mono Lake, was to checkerboard a small area and then by eye estimate the number of birds that were seen in those areas. And we flew over Bolinas and Tamales Bay and the San Francisco Bay area, and on those occasions. And then I had occasion while I was here in this region to visit Grizzly Island and the waterfowl management over there, and I had seen ducks in other parts within the valley, Merced Wildlife Management Area, Los Banos, and I remember that I want to use the phrase, the vast numbers of waterfowl that I saw, those species and others, including swans, although the swans were not, they were seen not directly in connection with Mono Lake, they were seen within the basin. But geese, certainly, around Mono Lake, and teal, there were at least 2 species of teal, where their numbers on Mono Lake exceeded anything that I had seen in any of these other localities that I had toured, or you might say, quote, surveyed, unquote, with the wildlife biologists here, the waterfowl biologists, they call them out of this region. And it certainly was a sight to behold, and an extremely impressive experience over there within the basin, and distinct and apart, of course, from my principal forte, which was in fisheries.
I think that's a good summary, Mr. Vestal. Thank you very much. I think we're ready for cross-examination by Mr. Birmingham now.
Vestal. My name is Tom Birmingham. I'm with Chronic Moskowitz, Tiedemann, and Gerard, and as I stated earlier, I'm the attorney that is representing the City of Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power of the City of Los Angeles in connection with these proceedings. I'm going to conduct a cross-examination of you. If during the course of the cross-examination you feel for any reason you want to take a break, please let me know.
Thank you.
And we will take a break. I believe you stated that you began your tenure in the Eastern Sierras in 1938 or 1939. Is that correct?
For a continued period in 1939, however, I did make some early observations on my travel through the basin on April 30th, 1938, at which time I took occasion to stop. It had been a heavy snowstorm. That year was a heavy winter, and I took occasion to stop at Divining Creek and note the high flow, which exceeded 100, in my estimation, since I had just come fresh from water surveys over in the Eel River Basin, exceeded 100 second feet, and it was quite frothy, a lot of white water and quite turbulent. And noted the condition of the stream and the tremendous flow coming down there, both above and below Highway 395 crossing. There was snow everywhere, of course. And they did the same thing again at Rush Creek. I stopped, this was the old 395 bridge, and again the snow-covered riparian, and I estimated it looked to me like it was a beautiful stream at that flow coming down, which I estimated exceeded between 75 and 100 second feet. It was closer to me, in mind's eye, closer to 75 second feet. I then went on to my assignment at Convict Lake.
You were in, prior to World War II, you were in the Mono Basin until 1942, is that correct?
That is correct.
And then after World War II, well, during World War II, you served in the military, and you returned in April of 1946 to the Eastern Sierra?
Returned in March of 1946 to the Eastern Sierra.
Excuse me. And then you worked in the Eastern Sierra until 1950 when you were transferred to...
The Fresno region, yes. Headquarters in Fresno.
Now, from a review of the weekly reports that you turned in, and I reviewed all of them, it appears that during the period from 1939 to 1942, your work involved primarily a creel census on June Lake. Is that correct?
Yes, that was initially that was the primary assignment. It was really a carryover from the break-in work under the California Trout investigation at Convict Lake. But that creel census then continued on in 1939, 1940, 41, and 42. It was terminated in 1942, just before I went into the military.
And your observations of Lower Rush Creek were more limited. I think you testified that you made observations as time permitted. Is that correct?
Well, the observations actually, I became aware fairly early on of the reconstruction of Grant Lake Dam, and I made rather frequent trips down Rush Creek. These are sort of, and on those trips, as time permitted, I'd go all the way to Lower Rush Creek, but. I'd stop at the LA Ventura to note the flow, the condition in the stream and the flow there. And then I took one or two occasions to photograph the changes that were taking place during the reconstruction of Grant Lake Dam in 1939. And I followed the reconstruction period on through the changes that were taking place in 1940, at which time the cover, the riparian cover at the inlet of Grant Lake Dam was destroyed by the city with great battleship chains between two, let's see, D8 cats and and stacked and burned, and the contributions of that to the despoilation of pollution of Grant Lake. And then I would stop to note the outflow from Grant Lake, and on down, as time permitted, I would look into the stream between Grant Lake and the old Highway 395 crossing. And in 1939, as a matter of fact, I took a photograph there looking upstream of Rush Creek at that crossing. And then I would take occasion, as time permitted, to examine since it was a kind of a sub-assignment by the President of the Fish and Game Commission to then Nate Milner to do some work at his one of his favorite places at Little Walker Lake, to examine the irrigation diversions and the condition of Parker Creek and Walker Creek above and below the diversions at that point, the irrigation points. So I became fairly familiar with those locations. And then on the opening, each season, about the opening of the fishing season, and at the so-called pressure points, when fishermen would congregate there, I took occasion to check with anglers and examine their catches, and I'd also, in contacts with the wardens and the anglers themselves, I would get information. I mentioned earlier the liaison between these people, and in that fashion, I would add to the survey file and the inventory file that I was obligated to assign to develop and maintain as part of my responsibilities.
Now, your notes and your weekly reports were quite detailed. In fact, I noticed that your weekly reports contained references to having different state vehicles maintained and repaired. Is that correct?
It's very important in that area, especially in the fall and the winter time.
So is it correct that your weekly reports would have contained all of the visits you made to Lower Rush Creek during the period from 1939 to 1940? No,
they did not. The reports did not contain. There was a time factor involved, and there was certainly a guideline set forth by the supervising fisheries biologist. So I didn't detail everything that was done every day, and in some of the on special assignments like this one I mentioned to Mr. Milner, and at times in monthly reports, I would attempt to add to the material that was in the weekly reports, perhaps augment that somewhat.
Now, a few moments ago, you made reference to an L.A. Venturi weir, and there are references to the L.A. Venturi weir in your testimony. That is a weir that existed above the inflow into Grant Lake Reservoir, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, with respect to Lee Vining Creek, is it correct that your personal observations of Lee Vining Creek were limited during the period from 1939 to 1942?
Comparatively so. I did have an opportunity to walk out portions of them, portions of Lee Vining Creek, and particularly between the diversion dam above the ranger station on down to Highway 395 crossing, and then below the powerhouse. And I had an opportunity, took an opportunity to observe the stream just above its entrance into Mono Lake. And I have, matter of fact, one of the photos that I borrowed, you might say, from files of the MVZ in Berkeley was quite representative of what I saw there with the riparian, arboreal cover and the riparian situation at that time. That was taken in 1916 by Joseph Dixon, who was part of that survey, Sierra Transect survey out of Berkeley.
Now, in your written testimony, it states that that Levining Creek was considered an excellent fishery prior to DWP's diversions. Is that correct?
It was a good fishery.
Now that statement is based on what you were told by others, isn't that right?
Principally by the old-timers in the area and by the wardens, who certainly were more familiar because of their patrol activities, and on whom I depended rather heavily at times.
Was Mr. Dombrowski one of the old-timers that you tended to rely on?
Well, Walt wasn't as much of an old-timer as some of the other people. It was not my impression that Walt was that much of an old-timer. There were people like Bill Banta and the Hesses, and there were the McPhersons, Wallace McPherson, and of course his mother, Mrs. McPherson. There were others. One of the old-timers who I saw more often than not in June Lake was Ad Farrington, who was part of the Farrington family. It goes back many years, of course, as you know. But there were a number of these people.
Mr. Vestal, I don't want you to not give complete answers to any of the questions that I asked or ask, but I am limited in the amount of time that I have. In fact, I'm probably going to be cut off by my colleagues with a great deal of glee. But if you would just restrict your answers to my questions, I would appreciate that very much. Now, with respect to Mr. Dombrowski specifically, did you ever know him to exaggerate reports to you?
I thought that Walt was pretty accurate. We employed him. That was one of the bases for employment, as a matter of fact. I did inquire into him before we employed him as a checker down at on the Rush Creek Test Stream project, and the records that he kept for us and the accuracy that he incorporated in, for example, the waterfowl maps that he drew as part of his contributions to the Pacific Flyway census in 1948. There were indications there that he not only knew what he was talking about, but he took pains in putting things together, putting these reports together. He kept temperatures and kept observations for us there at Rush Creek, which during his tenure with us, which in a way were above and beyond the call.
Now, isn't it correct that in December of 1947, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong date. It was April of 1946. Mr. Dombrowski reported to you that hundreds of fish were being stranded in Rush and Levining Creeks and also Gibbs Creek. And that upon your investigation, you were not able to substantiate his report of hundreds of fish being stranded, but in fact you only found one fish that was stranded?
It is true that I found one fish that was stranded. At the time that I got there, the report was given to Walt by several people. And at the time that I got there, I'm very sure that natural consequences had taken place. In other words, perhaps anglers, sheep herders, who almost always got word of stranded trout ahead of our approach. There were probably natural predators that took their share of the fish. So consequently, the numbers of stranded fish, at the time in that particular situation, at the time I got there, were very much diminished.
Now, you indicated in your testimony that the fish on Lee Vining Creek were somewhat smaller than the fish caught on Rush Creek. Is that correct?
The average of fish caught on Lee Vining Creek was between the average was between about 8 to 10 inches, but some of the fish were a few of the fish were ranges upward around 14 inches or so.
Now, isn't it correct that that was about the same length of fish that was caught in Rush Creek prior to the city's diversions? As I recall, you testified on this subject in Judge Finney's courtroom. Is that correct?
Yes, I testified in Judge Finney's court.
And at that time, did you testify that the average length of fish in Rush Creek was about 8 inches? I'm talking about lower Rush Creek.
Yes, I'm referring to Lower Rush Creek. My impression was that this was the implication, Lower Rush Creek. The difference being that you had a range, a much greater range. The average in the bulk of Rush Creek may have been smaller as a result of the reduced somewhat as a result of the planting, but you had a range there of fish up to several pounds, which went into the delta section, and the delta section was like a raceway. There were deeper pools there, and the section received downstream drift of stream bottom foods, and the fish in the delta also availed themselves of we inferred that this was the case of shrimp and flies out of Mona Lake.
During your second tour in the Eastern Sierra after the war, you were responsible for an experimental program on Lower Rush Creek. Is that right?
Yes.
And the portion of Rush Creek designated as the test stream for that experiment was the portion below what's known as the gorge or the narrows. Is that correct?
Yes.
And among the reasons that you selected that portion of Rush Creek as the test stream for this program was because it was typical of a heavily fished trout stream on the Eastern Sierra. Isn't that right?
As typical as we could find in that situation. If you may recall from that publication, 1954, there were several specifications in there, and it was a case of trying to evaluate these specifications, arrive at a situation where we had sustained flows, at least we hoped were going to be sustained, plus a very important element of control, both for access and for stocking.
But it is correct that your 1954 report on this test stream, and here I'm referring to page 89 of CalTrout Exhibit 5S, states that...
Well, hang on, Counsel. The witness get the document.
Absolutely.
The reference again?
Page 89, which is the first page of the report.
I have it.
It states under the description of the test stream, the stream was fairly typical of a heavily fished trout stream, of heavily fished trout streams on the east slope of the Sierra Nevada. Is that correct?
Yes, we thought so. The average width and the average depth, the distribution of it didn't have perhaps the fluctuations at that time when this project was going. It didn't have the annual fluctuations, but we thought so for the purposes of this program.
Now, your testimony states that it wasn't until 1947 that the Department of Water and Power began diverting major amounts of water out of the Mono Basin. Is that correct?
Before Mr. Vestal answers that question, the record should reflect that according to Mr. Valentine's electronic timer, we've just completed the first 20 minutes of cross-examination.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Dodge, and I will make an application to the absent Mr. Del Piero for an additional 20 minutes, which I'm sure would be granted.
Which will not be opposed.
May I have that question again?
Sure, absolutely, and maybe I can refer to specifically to your testimony. On page 18 of your written testimony, do you have a copy of that in front of you?
Yes, I have it.
Down at the bottom, of 3 lines from the bottom, in fact, it states that it was in 1947 that LA began diverting major amounts of water out of the Mono Basin. Is that your memory?
In 1947, we first became aware that the stream above the gorge was dried up, was being dried up. And the inference was that it was all going out via the tunnel. And hence, that inference. I did not have it at the time, I did not have specific records. But because of that observation at the test stream and above the narrows or the gorge, that was the inference.
Now, at the time your experiment started in 1947, isn't it correct that the condition of Rush Creek below the gorge was representative of its condition prior to diversions by DWP out of the basin?
In 1947?
When your program started in 1947?
I don't think so.
Now, you have included with your testimony several photographs that you have indicated were taken in 1947 in connection with your program.
Yes.
And with respect to the photographs, you've indicated in your testimony that the photographs represent the conditions of the stream prior to the city's diversions in 1941. Is that correct? For instance, on...
Objection. Witness is still
Can you give me
attempting to verify your first question.
Well, if he doesn't know the answer, Mr. Thomas, that's
Well, I'm sure
fine.
he'll answer it in due course, Counsel.
Well, let's have a question and then an answer and proceed in the traditional way here. I think Mr. Birmingham was about to give Mr. Vestal a specific question.
a specific reference, Mr. Williams?
Yes.
This is what I'm
Absolutely. I'll give you
for.
one. On page 12, there's a reference to a photograph of Rush Creek that you took on February 21, 1947.
Yes.
Showing what you referred to as wonderful gravels, riparian cover of dense willows and cottonwoods, and a good fishing area. Now, was that representative of what the stream looked like in 1941?
That,
You're referring specifically to the gravels and the riparian, is that?
No, I'm referring specifically to the photograph.
The question is whether the photograph, excuse me, the question is whether the photograph accurately represents pre-1940 conditions.
Let me state the question. Mr. Vestal, the conditions that are depicted in this photograph, which you've attached to your testimony, is Caltrout Exhibit 5K. Is that photograph, the conditions depicted in that photograph, typical of the conditions that existed on the stream in 1941 below the gorge?
I would say no. It, I do not recall, I couldn't typify from that photograph the conditions at that time.
On paragraph 32, which is on page 13 of your testimony, looking at paragraph 32, it states that the quality of Rush Creek habitat in the historical period was clearly the most important factor in the superior quality of the fishery. The lower section, given natural flow levels, was a very rich area for trout food production and contained excellent trout habitat in terms of riparian cover and gravels. Now, that's a reference to the period prior to the department's diversions. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Now, further down on the same
Now, by
paragraph...
department, you're talking about Department of Water and Power.
Yes, I am. Thank you for clarifying that. Further down, it states that the reach from the Narrows to the lake, the Delta area in particular, provided this type of important habitat, not only in terms of food production, but also channel refuge and cover. The excellent quality of the Delta area is illustrated by Exhibit CT5M. Now, that's another photograph that you took in 1947. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Now, does that photograph represent the conditions that existed on the stream in 1941?
I would say that at that level of flow in 1941, that certainly would represent the conditions that existed at that time on Rush Creek.
All right, finally, I'd like to look at paragraph 36 of your testimony.
36?
36, yes. You refer in paragraph 36 to a photograph CT5P, Caltrout 5P. And you say that it's a photograph that you took of an angler fishing on Rush Creek as it existed in 1947. Are you able to find it?
Yes, I have it right here.
Okay. Now, with respect to the photograph, you say that within the photograph there is a dense riparian cover, beautiful gravels, and a nice flow of approximately 20 CFS. And then you go on to say, this photograph, Caltrout Exhibit 5P, is representative of the conditions on Rush Creek before LA's diversions began to have a serious impact. Is that correct?
Referring there to conditions that took place gradually in time as the flows in the spring, because already the springs were on the downtrend. And it represented, it was at a time when, at the start of that downtrend, the constriction began to take place in the habitat.
Now, in 1947, isn't it correct that the flows in the springs were 24 CFS?
The record shows that we recorded and I published in this paper 24 second feet for 1947.
Mr. Vestal, if Mr. Birmingham, by mistake, interrupts you, let him know so that you can complete your answer. I didn't think you'd completed your answer to the last question, but I might be wrong on that. Yeah. But the important thing is, if you're not finished with an answer and some lawyer starts to give you another question, just tell that lawyer that you haven't quite finished yet.
Yes, please do that, Mr. Vestal. Now, with respect to a chart that you prepared, and I'm not sure that it was given a number. I believe it's Caltrout Exhibit 5E.
5E. Yes.
In your testimony, you say that Caltrout Exhibit 5E is a true and correct copy of the chart that you had prepared reflecting data you collected on Mono Lake tributaries. Is that correct?
This is true.
Now, does this chart 5E represent the historical conditions of those tributaries?
This,
Objection, ambiguous as to what you mean by historical and how it relates to the onset of diversions.
Well, I believe that we had, when Mr. Vestal was talking in his testimony about historical conditions, you meant to refer to the conditions that existed prior to the department's diversions. Is that correct, Mr. Vestal?
that's right, we're going back quite a ways. And I did, in the researching back in the historical period, I did, for example, under volume of flow, I've got dates there ranging 1911 to 1912, and a range from 16 to 1280 CFS. So the data goes back. It was not just confined to the more contemporary period.
Now, with respect to the springs and the seepage below the gorge in Rush Creek, you show that during the historical period, the springs and were flowing at up to 18 CFS in meadow section below gorge. Is that correct? And let me show you my copy.
In Rush Creek? In Rush Creek. Let's see. Up to 18 second feet in the meadow section below the gorge.
So that was
This,
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Was that the figure that you had for the historical period?
that was the figure, well, it was the figure that I had on record, which was a metered flow by Claude James, taken at the, that was taken on the day that he recorded 152 second feet coming from above the Narrows. The day that he made the supplementary record at the bridge, the ford, the upper bridge, to indicate the total on that day of 170 second feet.
Now, I'd like to ask you a question about these photographs again that you've submitted from 1947. Is it correct that these photographs depict the conditions of the stream before, and I'll use your terms, serious impacts from the city's diversion?
Objection ambiguous. I think you need to take them one by one.
I will. Your testimony clearly states, Mr. Vestal, that let's refer to it again. I'm looking at paragraph 36 again.
36.
That
All right.
Caltrop Exhibit 5P is representative of the conditions on Rush Creek before LA's diversions began to have a serious impact. Is that your opinion?
In the sense that I referred to earlier, that these photographs were taken in 1947, and from that time on, there was greater and greater, and as shown in the record, greater and greater constriction and downtrend in the habitat.
But what I'm asking about is specifically what's shown in that photograph 5P, Caltrop 5P. Is that representative of the condition of Rush Creek before LA's diversions began to have serious impacts on the stream?
I would say that represented the condition on that particular time and flow, which was a matter of release from Grant Lake.
Now, you say that the flow and the photograph depicts a beautiful, or I'm sorry, a nice flow of approximately 20 CFS. Is that correct?
That was, I believe that was, that's reasonably correct, yes.
Now, you would agree, would you, that nice flow of 20 CFS would have kept in good condition the fish that existed in that portion of the stream?
I would have to, over a period of time, I would have to evaluate the condition of the fishery, and that would have to be a sustained situation in order to arrive at that judgment.
But if there was a sustained flow, as depicted in that picture, Caltrout
Of 22nd feet.
5P of 22nd feet, that would keep the fish in that portion of the stream in good condition?
Objection asked and answered.
I'm trying to clarify.
It would be sufficient for that purpose.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a question about a proposal. If there were flows in Rush Creek that a minimum release out of Grant Lake of 35 CFS and no diversions of Walker and Parker Creek, but a minimum flow, as I say, a minimum release during the winter of 35 CFS out of Grant Lake, with flows ranging up to 106 CFS in July. Releases out of Grant Lake up to 106 CFS in July.
160 or 106?
106.
106.
With no diversion of Walker or Parker. Would those flows keep in good condition the fishery that existed in Rush Creek in 1941?
This would be my inference as a result of the IFIM studies that were carried out by the Department of Fish and Game under contract. These were very carefully evaluated, and these are part of, I take it, part of the results. And this would be my inference based on that data and the conclusions that were arrived at by those studies.
Now, I'm not referring specifically to the studies. I'm referring to your
opinion.
Your opinion, particularly as it existed back in 1941. Is it correct that shortly after the Department of Water and Power began its diversions in 1941, you wrote to the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and requested a release of 5 CFS out of Grant Lake Reservoir?
Yes.
And isn't it correct that at that time you said that release of 5 CFS would maintain in good condition the fish that existed below Grant Lake Reservoir?
Yes, and if you may recall the record, this was a stopgap recommendation which exceeded authority. I had to take some criticism by our administration, our department at that time, as a result of that communication with Mr. Jones.
Now, if in response...
Objection, the witness is still answering the question.
Have you finished your answer, Mr. Vestal?
Well, what I wanted to emphasize.
If you haven't finished any question when I interrupt you, please let me know that, okay?
Counsel, you've been very clear. Just slow down and he'll have a chance to answer you.
I wanted to emphasize that this was, and I did so point out before the court that this was a stopgap measure. It did not evaluate water rights. It wasn't concerned. It was concerned with saving a situation in Grant Lake, which was threatened by a warm weather period. And there were a lot of factors involved in making that recommendation. So I made it low enough so that it would sustain for a time. until hopefully thunderstorms and other flows, return flow or something would supplement conditions, supplement the flow and supplement conditions. But it was under those, subject to those restrictions, you might say, or guidelines by the department. It was
I'm listening.
it was just a stopgap recommendation.
Now, it's correct, isn't it, that what you said, this was a letter that you sent on March 17, 1941, is that correct?
Objection, he doesn't have one in front of him.
Well, let's take a moment so we can
Right.
find the letter.
I have it.
Now, you said that you would greatly appreciate the department.
Let me just say that the record should reflect that Mr. Valentine's timer has recorded the expiration of the second 20-minute cross-examination.
I appreciate your making that clear on the record.
Mr. Birmingham, do you have an estimate as to how much longer?
I probably have an additional 15 minutes.
I saw the reference, Mr. Birmingham.
Thank you.
Excuse me, since his summary of direct only took 40 minutes, nobody's going to object to you proceeding to another 15 minutes, but I think the record should at least reflect why it is you need the extra time.
Well, the reason that I need the extra time, Mr. Valentine, is that Mr. Vestal's answers, and I don't want to cut him off, but Mr. Vestal's answers have gone significantly beyond the questions that I've asked him. And again, I don't want to cut Mr. Vestal off because Mr. Vestal has very important information for the board, but I think we can all agree that his answers have gone beyond the specific questions that were asked.
Let's go.
The reference that you have, that I'm making to your March 17, 1941 letter says, I would greatly appreciate the department turning in and maintaining a flow in that part of Rush Creek at all times of not less than 5 cubic feet per second. This amount would assure maintenance of the fish life therein in good condition, would permit a regular stocking policy for the stream by the Department of Fish and Game, and would provide for such irrigation as, and I can't read the rest of it on the
As Mono Basin in the vicinity seasonally requires. Is that the end of your excerpt?
Yes, yes it is. Now, did this letter on March 17, 1941 accurately reflect your opinion about the effect that 5 CFS would have had in maintaining in good condition the fish life that existed in that portion of the stream referred to in the letter?
Subject to the guidelines that I previously stated, Mr. Birmingham, also the fact that this was in response to complaint by local people. This was called to my attention by one of the local wardens, and not taking into consideration the release guidelines that were given to me earlier by the district ranger, Mr. Fisher. Above all, not following the, or not in full cognizance of the you might say, the administrative guidelines by Mr. Taft, the chief of the Bureau of Fish Conservation at that time, in which later I in response, the department's response, and also Mr. Taft's response, and you're familiar with that letter. It was embarrassing. But it did not, on a permanent basis, it did not, the phrase Rush Creek at all times of less than 5 cubic feet per second. I did not mean to imply that this was to last more than the period, the emergency period that was occurring at that time with respect to Grant Lake.
Now, if in response to this letter, the Department of Water and Power had come back and said, well, to maintain in good condition the fish that exist in Rush Creek below Grant Lake, we are going to have a release of 35 CFS minimum out of Rush Creek, of Grant Lake. We are not going to divert Parker and Walker Creek any further. In your opinion, would those flows, the 35 CFS in the upper portion of Rush Creek, plus the contribution from Parker and Walker below the gorge, would those flows have maintained in good condition the fish that existed in Rush Creek?
I think that would have to be thoroughly evaluated. There's so many factors involved there, Mr. Birmingham, that it would have to be evaluated. I could not really, in all honesty, verbalize an opinion on that.
Let me state my objection for the record. My objection is that the question is ambiguous, whether it refers to the conditions which existed, including the channel form as of March 17th, 1941, or to the conditions which exist today.
My basis of my objection is the ambiguity of the Parker and Walker diversion. Are we saying that the hypothetical involves only the cessation of diversion by Los Angeles Water and Power, or the cessation of diversion by all of the existing sub-lessees, Game Ranch and tributary landowners?
The channel in Rush Creek, as it existed below the gorge in 1941, was that significantly altered as a result of the city's diversions before you published your paper in 1954?
Yes. The channel was altered in that there was increased constriction of flows. The flows got down, as you know, down to at one point in 1951 to 1 second foot. There was encroachment. There was a damaging encroachment by riparian cover to the point where in 1951 we had to employ a small bulldozer to create pools and drop structures in the stream in order to maintain a habitat in a restricted section. It was on a trial basis.
But prior to 1941, in periods other than the runoff period, is it correct that Rush Creek consisted primarily of a single channel below the gorge?
Prior to 1941? As I recall, it consisted of a main stem channel, but at higher flows, any flood flows coming down there, I don't know whether they were fresh flows or spill flows or what they were. There was certainly spill out over the meadows and went through meanders.
And subsidiary channels?
You might call it that, yes.
Now, is that the reason?
Channels.
Okay. Now, the Caltrout Exhibit 5 S contains a map of what's referred to as the test portion of the stream, which is Rush Creek below the gorge. Is that correct?
On the right-hand side of the page, at page 91?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct.
And is it correct that, excluding periods of high runoff, that this map depicts the main channel of Rush Creek as it existed prior to 1941?
Yes, and this was determined from a combination of aerial photos and USGS photos,
Thank you.
or maps.
Does the 1954 report that you prepared in connection with your study, Caltrout Exhibit 5S, reflect the opinions that you held in 1954 at the time the report was published?
I think essentially so. We certainly, as a result of the studies and the report, these opinions, we were compelled to modify them. And as you noticed there in the report, this affected statewide, well, stocking policies throughout the Mono-Inu area and statewide subsequently.
Now, in your report, it says that most anglers had only poor to fair fishing. Is that correct? And here I'm referring specifically to page 101 of the report.
Table 5, 101.
No, this is actually in the text, Mr. Vestal, on page 101. It states that under angling intensity and angling success,
yes.
Thus most anglers still had only poor to fair fishing, with the bulk of the fish caught by a minority. Was that your opinion in 1954?
This was the fact of the matter, judging from the records.
And with respect to the wild trout fishery, you stated that well, let me ask a couple of follow-up questions on that, if I may. Even with substantial planning, most anglers had only poor to fair fishing. Is that correct?
That's true.
And to ameliorate the problem of a minority of the anglers catching the majority of the fish, you suggested that that a bag limit, or that the bag limit, be reduced. Is that correct?
Let's see.
And again, I would refer you to page 101 of the document.
The desirability of a reduced bag limit on waters under this type of management, yes. So the fish would be more equitably distributed.
Now, on page 97 of the document, you conclude that a satisfactory fishing in the stream could only be maintained by planting catchable trout in the stream throughout the season. Is that correct?
Throughout the season, yes, that's correct.
And wasn't it your ultimate conclusion that without such stocking, the fishing would have deteriorated early in the season?
Without that kind of stocking, the program would have fallen flat on its face because of the type of angling pressure that the test stream section was subjected to. That was almost predetermined because of due to our observations on other heavily fished waters in Inu Mono.
Very quickly, Mr. Vestal, I'd like to ask you some questions about specific testimony contained in your written testimony. On page 10, you make reference to a decision made in 1925 to establish a hatchery on the upper tributary of Rush Creek in order to take advantage of the superior breeding and nursery habitat. Now, that hatchery was placed above Grant Lake Reservoir, isn't that correct?
Yes, at that time, that's right.
Okay. Now, further down in the next paragraph, it says that your recollection concerning the abundance of fish in Rush Creek are supplemented by contemporaneous fishing data from the period, and then you make reference to a statement in the 29th biennial report. Now, that statement is about the fishery that existed in Grant Lake Reservoir and above in Rush Creek. Isn't that correct?
There's nothing said in this about the fishery at Grant Lake. It's just the result of escapement from Grant Lake into the egg collecting station and upstream. But nothing is said here about the fishery of Grant Lake.
But this egg collection statement was above Grant Lake Reservoir?
That's true.
So when there are references in the 29th biennial report to that the egg collections were very gratifying because black-spotted trout of the region have an excellent lot of eggs that produce vigorous embryos and develop into strong, healthy fish. That's a reference to eggs taken from fish above Grant Lake Reservoir.
That's correct.
Now, you, in your testimony and in your oral summary of your testimony, you referred to cutthroat trout. Are cutthroat trout also known as black-spotted trout?
Yes, there's some variation there, but they're all Salmo-clarkienchoi. They're all the same species.
Now, with respect to that portion of Rush Creek below Grant Lake during the period of the 30s and in 1941 when the city began its diversions, isn't it correct that there were no cutthroat trout in the lower portion of Rush Creek?
At this time?
In the 30s and in 1941 when the city began its diversions.
This, to my knowledge, this is true.
Your testimony.
We have no evidence that they existed below Grant Lake Dam.
Now, your testimony makes reference to Rush Creek as being a fishing mecca. Is that correct?
It was at a time, in that period that I described earlier in my testimony, yes.
Now, isn't it also correct that even when the lower portion of Rush Creek was dry, and when I'm referring to the portion below Grant Lake Reservoir, that portion of Grant Lake Reservoir, the portion of Rush Creek above Grant Lake Reservoir, continued to be a fishing mecca?
It continued to be heavily fished, yes.
And didn't Grant Lake Reservoir and that portion of Rush Creek above Grant Lake Reservoir continue to be a good fishery?
It continued for a time, but then as Hot Creek Hatchery, as angling intensity increased and as Hot Creek Hatchery developed, it was coming into higher and greater production. As more and more fishing pressure occurred and it would receive more heavier stocking. I think this term is applicable, yes.
Now, this map that you've attached to your testimony as exhibit, Caltrout Exhibit 5C, refers to Mono County as a fisherman's paradise. Is that correct?
Well, the records early on certainly showed that. For a number of years, let's see, we have a reference here to one of the reports of the Fish and Game Commission that Mono County was #1 in fishing statewide.
Isn't it correct that Mono County continues to be one of the highest rated counties for trout fishing statewide?
I am not aware of recent data. We know of no records. I don't think the angler catch survey has been catch, that type of survey has been continued, Mr. Birmingham. I'm not aware of this. It may have in another form.
I don't think I have any further questions.
Okay, Mr. Valentine's beeper has 2 minutes and 40 seconds remaining on the third 20 minutes, so your last estimate was pretty good. Department of Fish and Game is next.
Yeah, let's take a break before we start.
This is a video camera operator, we're not going off the record.